Thrones and kingdoms will bow down, and every chain will break as broken hearts declare his praise. For who can stop the Lord Almighty? Our God is the Lion of Judah. He's roaring with power and fighting our battles, and every knee will bow before him. Our God is the Lamb that was slain for the sins of the world. His blood breaks the chains, and every knee will bow before the Lion and the Lamb. Every knee will bow before him.
Good morning. Today I want to start a series of messages that I believe are extremely relevant to the times we're living in. It's a message about loving our neighborhoods. And it all starts with the Great Commandment. I heard a story a number of years ago. I don't know if it's true, but I believe it is true. In the last century in communist China, somewhere in a rural area, there lived a rice farmer who was secretly a Christian. Now, as you know, in communist China, it was and still is illegal to belong to any church and practice any Christianity that isn't sanctioned by the government. And this man was a Christian, and so he kept it to himself, kind of underground. Every morning, he arose and he went out and pumped water into his rice paddies around his home. And later each morning, his neighbor, who lived just a little bit below him, went and punched holes in all the dikes around his rice paddies so that water would flow into his own rice paddies. Day after day, this occurred. The Christian farmer would get up and pump water into his rice paddies, and then his neighbor who lived below him would divert that water into his own rice paddies. The Christian farmer was beside himself with frustration, but he was afraid to say anything about it or to confront his neighbor because his neighbor was an ardent communist. The Christian farmer, was afraid that his Christian faith would be discovered and he would be denounced by his neighbor as a traitor. So the Christian farmer prayed. He prayed day and night, crying out to the Lord for justice, crying out to the Lord to punish his communist neighbor. Finally, after some weeks, he got an answer to his prayers. The next morning, he got up a little bit earlier than usual, and he went down to his neighbor's farm and started pumping water onto his neighbor's rice paddies. And then when he was finished with that, he went back up to his farm and pumped into his own rice paddies. He did this day after day, and each day the farmer below him, the communist, would come out and be amazed to see that his rice paddies were already full of water. Finally, his communist neighbor asked him why he was doing this. And from then on, the communist neighbor pumped water into his own rice paddies. Neighbors. I've been thinking about neighbors recently. I've been reading several books about neighbors and being a Christian in your neighborhood. And I've gleaned some good ideas from some of these books, and that's what I'd like to be sharing with you in the next several weeks. A couple of guys from Colorado, Jay Pathak and Dave Runyon, have written this one book called The Art of Neighboring. And today I'm going to share some of their insights. I love the title of their book because it describes what this process of loving our neighborhood really is. It's an art. Since we're dealing with humans and with God, it's about relationships more than programs. This is not a 10 easy lessons or 5 hard lessons to, make your neighborhood perfect. It's about relationships, not programs. The fact is, there's neighbors all around us. Unless we're hermits and live far from any settlement, we're going to have neighbors. And just like family, we do not always get to choose our neighbors, but we can choose how we relate to them. Let me ask you, do you think there's any difference between Christians and non-Christians in how they relate to neighbors? Sure, on a case-by-case basis, you're going to find some differences. In fact, sometimes you're going to find that the non-Christians are better neighbors than the Christians. But overall, do you think there's any difference between non-Christians and Christians in how they relate to their neighbors? When Jesus was asked, what is the greatest commandment? He simply answered with what is written in Scripture, something known by heart by all observant Jews. Quoting Deuteronomy chapter 6, he replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your strength, and with all your mind. This is the first and the greatest commandment." And then he said, "And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." And he was quoting Leviticus there. These 2 commandments, he says, sum up all the law and the prophets. So it's really pretty simple. Jesus tells us to love God with all we've got and then love our neighbor. Now, loving God actually becomes pretty natural when you realize, and it's not just a head thing, it's in the heart too, when you realize the greatness, the awesomeness of God, his fantastic power, and then you realize that God is good. This awesome God who created the heavens and earth is good. And he's not only good in general terms, he's good to you. When you realize that he cares about you and he wants to keep you close in his goodness and grace, then a joy starts welling up in your life. Now, as to that second commandment that Jesus shared, here's the secret. You won't really be able to love your neighbor as yourself unless you are earnestly seeking to know and love God and to receive that love and grace that comes from him and realize that joy welling up in your life because of it. That's what gives you the strength to love neighbors who aren't like you, or even some of the folks around you don't like. Sticking to God is what enables you to see that difficult neighbor as God does. One of his creation, whom he wants to redeem into his family, just like you. So, who is a neighbor? That phrase, "you shall love your neighbor as yourself," is repeated 8 times in the Bible, so I'd guess it's pretty important. Now, just like the expert in the law who asked Jesus, we're also prone to ask, well, who really is my neighbor? And Jesus responded, you might remember, to that question by telling a story called the story of the Good Samaritan, who helped a stranger in need who was found along the roadside. And a point of the story, of course, came when Jesus told the man to go and do like that Good Samaritan who helped the stranger along the road. So a neighbor is not necessarily someone we would choose to be in our close friend group, our affinity group, our small group, or whatever. A neighbor is someone who is nearby, wherever you are. These days, many of us live in neighborhoods with people who may come from different cultures, countries, or even speak different languages than we're accustomed to. Nevertheless, they're nearby. I think a lot of Christians, when they hear the story of the Good Samaritan, they think, oh yeah, I can be like the Good Samaritan. I'll give $10 to that mission project to help those folks who were hurt by the flood in Sierra Leone the other day. That's being a good neighbor. No, I'm thinking Jesus is talking to the people who are right around you. So when Jesus was asked to reduce everything in the Bible to one command, he said, love God with everything you've got and love your neighbor as yourself. Now, what if he meant that we should love our actual neighbors? Think about where you live. The people who are behind us, who live in front of us, who live on either side of us. What if he meant that we're supposed to love those folks? Let's talk a minute about communication. Despite the many ways we can now communicate digitally, our society is becoming more fragmented and divided. Have you noticed that? Fragmented and divided. And we so easily put people into categories without even knowing who they are. And the internet, which has brought us so much information at our fingertips, can bring us good news instantly and bad news instantly. It can bring us all kinds of stories that are heartwarming and wonderful, and all kinds of stories that are discouraging and disheartening. And it can bring us all kinds of stuff that's true and all kinds of stuff that's not true. People don't communicate much face-to-face with people they don't already know. And the reality is, most people today don't even know the names of most of their neighbors. Do you think our God, who is very personal, meant it to be that way? If you care about your neighborhood, what may or may not be going on in your neighborhood, then you're going to start with your own neighbors, aren't you? If you really want to love your neighbor as Jesus commanded us, then you begin with the most ancient of non-digital forms of communication. It's a form of communication that all us Christians should know. It's called prayer. Do you ever think about that? Asking for God's strength and insight to care for your neighbors, to be able to see your neighbors, those living right around you, with the same eyes with which God sees them. And then as you begin to care about them, you'll start praying for them. And you know what? It's really a good idea to learn the names of your neighbors so you can pray for them by name. You don't have to pray to fix them. Just pray for them and for God to be in their lives, and pray for God to help you see them as He sees them. As a human, you and I are quite limited in how we can help our neighbors, but God is unlimited in how He can help. The greatest thing you can do for your neighbor right now is to seriously pray for them on a regular basis. Remember this, God can do more for your neighbor in 1 minute than you could in a lifetime. But God does not force His blessing on anyone without an invitation. God is always a gentleman and never forces Himself upon people. Through your requests, through our requests in prayer, God has given permission, further authority, to work in our neighborhoods and work in your neighbors' lives. You see, we already have a certain amount of authority in prayer concerning our neighbors because what they do affects us. Remember the story of the Chinese rice farmer? And he prayed to God about that situation, and God finally gave him an answer. Maybe God had to wait until his heart was ready to receive that answer. Maybe that's the way it is with us. So what's it like living among strangers living on a street with people you don't know. Many of you have noticed that things are changing all around us. Technology, of course, is changing. I remember 15 years ago when I said, okay, I'm going to wait until they produce the final version of the laptop computer, and then I'll get one. Then I'm good. It's not happening, is it? Technology is changing at a breakneck speed. But our society, our culture is also changing. And that's even more uncomfortable in a number of ways. And I think it's safe to say that we find ourselves living among a greater variety of people, racially, ethnically, languages spoken, religions, greater variety of people than did our grandparents. Are many of those in the homes around you strangers to you? Here's what happens when you live among strangers. Or here's what can happen. It doesn't have to happen, but here's what can happen. It often happens when you live among strangers. First thing is isolation. We leave our house each morning, do whatever it is we do throughout the day, and then we come back and go inside. And this is especially true in the month of July in Bakersfield. We never get to know the people living around us, and they don't get to know us. Isolation is the first thing that can happen. The second thing that can happen is fear. Whatever is unknown is often fearful to us. We'll be wary of our neighbors, and they'll be wary of us. In which case, it's often easy to imagine the worst about your neighbors. Then the third thing that can happen is misunderstanding. When we don't know them and they don't know us, it's easy to get the wrong idea about our neighbors, and then we misconstrue motives. When you don't know somebody and don't communicate with them, and then they do something that you're not sure of or makes you a little uncomfortable, you start fantasizing about all their evil intentions, right? And this isn't the way that Jesus wanted it to be or wants us to live. If there is no noticeable difference in how Christians and non-Christians neighbor in our city, then maybe we need to look at ourselves and take steps to obey Jesus. We are, therefore, Christ's ambassadors, as though God were making his appeal through us. And sometimes the only Christian that somebody may know is you. Boy, oh boy. So it begins with simply being good neighbors. This is what we're going to focus on in the next several weeks, 5 more weeks actually after this. How can Christians, how can we make a positive difference in our own neighborhoods? It's like the leaven in the loaf that Jesus talked about, being out there, being kingdom people where we live. The isolation, the fear, the loneliness, and even the poverty and crime in our city's neighborhoods ultimately aren't going to be solved by government or police or schools or even getting more people in church. The healing of our city can really begin with us. So let's not be like that one neighbor. Man knocks on the door, says, "Madam, I'm the piano tuner." Woman inside replies, "I didn't send for the piano tuner." Man outside says, "I know, lady, but your neighbors did." So rather, let us be examples of a way of living that makes sense and brings peace to people's souls. Whenever we center our lives around the great commandment, love God with all you got, and then take seriously the idea and practice of loving our neighbors, that's when the healing begins. And that's what I want to be talking about in the next several weeks. By becoming good neighbors, we become who we're supposed to be. And there's a real freedom and peace in that. As a result, our communities become more like the places that God intended them to be. I don't know if any of you listen to KAXL radio. They have a studio right across the street from us. It's a Christian broadcasting company. Matter of fact, one of their DJs was in worship this morning, right here in our own church. And they started an emphasis. I haven't listened in the last week to see if it's still going, but a month back in July, they started an emphasis on this very thing that we're talking about. They called it Show Love Bakersfield, Operation Neighbor. Now, we're not the only Christians in town. So what a fantastic impact Christians could have in this city if we all loved our neighborhoods. So at this point, I want to get a little bit personal. I've got to admit to you my own shortcomings in regards to this neighboring. We've lived on the same street for 11 years, and we know only a few of our neighbors. And among those few, we only have some regular interaction with one or two. And it's been hitting me. If I'm going to fulfill Jesus' command to love our neighbors, I need to do a better job of getting to know my neighbors. How about you? Could you identify with that? And even more to the point, if I'm going to stand up here on Sunday mornings and exhort people to love their neighbors, man, I got to be doing it. So I'm following the suggestion of the authors of that book I mentioned, The Art of Neighboring. Here's my first step. I've made up this chart of sorts of some of the houses that surround ours. And that's what my chart looks like. It's really, see how nice and neat it is? You know, it's scribbled over here, a name written sideways, a paper clip. There's some notes on the back too. I'm going to eventually get it all together. It's going to look really cool. But, you know, I make it my goal now to fill in all the spots on this chart with the names and addresses of our neighbors. The addresses are really easy. All you got to do is walk down the sidewalk and look at the numbers on the house. Or if you live in an apartment building, you know the address for your apartment complex, and you can write down the apartment numbers. You know, that part's easy. The real challenge is getting to know the names of the folks who are inside there, each one of those homes. That's my challenge for God, to get to know all the names inside the homes. Here's your challenge for God. Join me by getting to know your neighbors, the names of each person in each of the households around you. Making a chart of the household helps you keep track. I would encourage you to do that. In the coming weeks, I plan to focus on then what it means to be a Christian neighbor and what actions we can take to live that out in our own neighborhoods. Whether you live in a suburban type neighborhood or a cul-de-sac or a rural lot or an apartment complex, you can make your own chart of the 8 who live closest to you, or maybe it's more than that. I had a couple of people after last service says, well, I already know all my neighbors. I said, well, maybe you get to know them better. Maybe you develop a friendship. Or maybe you need to expand on to another street. I don't know. Do something. As you begin to fill in the names of each person in the households, in time, hopefully you'll get acquainted, because I'm going to challenge myself and you to take a step beyond just knowing the names. And there's some other things we can do. And who knows? You know, might develop some friendships after all. If we all did that, we'd be making a personal connection with a lot of people in this city. And since we believe that God is personal and wants a personal relationship with each one of us, why shouldn't we be personable with those people who live closest around us? I'm not saying that we're going to go door to door and say, do you know Jesus? I am saying we should be the gospel by taking the first step of being good neighbors. Who knows? We could be taking the first steps toward transforming our neighborhoods, our city, even beyond that. So, in spite of all the digital communication that we have, people still value, they even crave personal connections. You have a personal connection with an awesome, good, and personal God, so live it. and then share it by being that awesome, good, and personable neighbor that your neighborhood needs. For the entire law is fulfilled in keeping this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.